What causes a sports performer to become violent in their activity? Let's see if we can actually address that question before addressing actually numerous others within this tutorial. Well, the first one, and if you've studied your aggression theories in sports psychology, you'll know a little bit about this. One of the biggest answers to this is the notion of frustration. Now, I'm not going to get into the exact aggression theories here, but we're talking specifically about a blocked obstacle to a goal. Now, you probably know I'm referring to the frustration aggression hypothesis there, but if somebody's trying to achieve something in sport and that goal becomes blocked by an obstacle, they may well get frustrated, and that frustrated can lead to aggression and violence. There are specific theories that describe that. We also find that athletes will sometimes retaliate in the sporting situation. Often the temperature's pretty warm and they will retaliate to, for example, an aggressive act by someone else. We could also be talking about an anger at a ref or an umpire or an official. They're sort of indignant about a decision or something like that. It could bring violence from a player. You've probably seen that. We'd also have something like the nature of the game. Now, you might be thinking, well, okay, boxing, MMA, but I'm talking about things more like rugby, ice hockey, physical contact sports where people are going to come into direct contact with one another, and of course there tends to be cultural and historic aspects to this as well, but the nature of the game could do so. Another one, and this is where it gets a bit insidious, I guess, is where violence increases chances of winning. You know, if you can effectively crock the opposition star player, then that can give you an opportunity to do better in your performance. Now, I don't think that's particularly common, but certainly being assertive, physical, demonstrating sort of that power of an opponent is not unusual. Linked to that might be the aim to injure an opponent. Now, I've kind of touched on that already, but somebody might be going out to do harm, right? That's what we might specifically describe as violence. And if I just come back to the last one links to this as well, and it might be the desire to intimidate, to kind of psychologically affect an opponent so that their performance diminishes as a result. So those are some, if not all, of the reasons why a performer might become violent in the sporting context. And I encourage you to reflect on whether you've ever experienced or even witnessed some of those. Now, we'd also like to address what are the causes of spectators being violent. Now, of course, these will have overlaps with what we've done already, but they will be different. So, for example, we do have the notion of frustration again. That's absolutely reasonable, but frustration here will tend to come at about the score or the result. Now, that's not completely different. It's just with the performer, we're talking about it specifically being a block goal. We also sort of suggest that sometimes spectator behaviour is ritualistic, and we can describe this as hooliganism. Good word, hooliganism, although it's a horrible thing. It's a good sounding word. Hooliganism or tradition. We've got this tradition, masculine male environment sometimes, and it can lead to violence perhaps. We've also got the notion of importance of the contest. So, for example, we might expect something like a grudge match between two teams, or a derby match might be more typically likely to lead to a violent encounter. Classic example would be something called alcohol or drugs, and of course we're going to look at ways to prevent violence in a moment, and we're going to obviously look at aspects of that. But I also want to bring to you another cause, which might be imitation. If the event, the sport, is violent or is broken into violence, the crowd may imitation of an opponent, is what I'm trying to write. Imitation of an opponent. And finally, and I think this is a really interesting word for you both to record, learn, and also reflect on, and it's the idea of de-individuation. Hard to say and spell that. So this is the idea that in a crowd, people will kind of lose their ethical, moral sense of what's right and wrong. They will get absorbed into a crowd atmosphere, and that could lead to some kind of violence. Now, where we want to go with the rest of this tutorial is we now want to address what might be implications. Okay, so I'm going to sort of look here at implications. If we have violence in sport, what does that mean? Implications, and I'm specifically initially going to look at implications for society. So if we have violence in our sporting context, what does that mean for all of us? Well, first of all, it's got costs. It's got the cost of policing. I guess that specifically refers to spectator side, but I suppose it could be the performer side as well. But we've also got the negative reputation internationally. You know, if the UK, or let's say England, where I happen to be sat recording this, If we become known as a violent sort of sporting nation, this damages and tarnishes our reputation internationally. It could lead to all kinds of potential problems off the back of that. The society would suffer what we might loosely describe as an L, by the way, loss of respect. Some people tell me my L's and my H's are the same, and I think that's probably reasonable criticism, actually. But there you go. We've got a loss of respect. People, of course, don't respect this kind of behaviour. We also might, as a society, experience damage to property. Now, yeah, that could be, say, the football stadium. But it could also be that this violence from the spectators spills into the local environment, and a town or a city centre becomes damaged, say, as an example. Let's just look at a couple of others. We might also have a fear from local people. So if, for example, you're living very close to, I don't want to name specific sports, but I'll just give an example. If you're living very close to an ice rink where an ice hockey team, there tends to be problems at their events. If you're living close to that could, of course, lead to fear from local people. Now, what I'd like to do next is I'd like to look at implications for the performer. Okay, so we'll look at implications for the performer. So if a performer, implications, performer, what is the outcome of this actually happening? If this happens in a performer's experience and they become violent, what's going to tend to happen? Well, classic would be loss of sponsors. So financial benefits are lost, let's say through sponsorship, because they become linked to this kind of behaviour. They might also experience lengthy bans. Okay, so they might experience lengthy bans, and of course that's going to be a problem. It affects their earning potential, affects their reputation, and that's my next point. They're also going to suffer a loss of reputation, and of course this is not a positive outcome for a sports performer who really is like a media sort of representative in professional sport. We could also be talking here about becoming a poor role model, and especially for children I'm talking there, they become a poor role model. That's going to be linked to the reputation, of course, and we could be talking here about this particular individual. Maybe they've been involved in a violent altercation and people have seen it. They might experience online abuse, or let's refer to it as criticism. I mean, obviously we don't condone online abuse, but it seems like kind of normal in this particular context that we're describing. The athlete's family might be affected. You can imagine that if a football player becomes violent in a televised football match and her parents witness this, that's going to be a negative implication for her parents. This person or these people that do this, they might lose their job. Of course, that's going to affect earnings as well. And we would also say that they might even be transferred. A particularly insidious incident, I can think of a couple that I think of. I mean, you guys won't remember this, but there's one from Diego Armando Maradona at the end of his Barcelona career, which was horrendous, and they sold him to Napoli immediately. And we might also argue that because of that reputational damage, if it's bad enough, nobody wants you, so you might not actually get signed elsewhere. Now, where I'd like to finish this off is to finally look at the implications for the sport. So if a sport becomes linked with violence, or performers or spectators become violent, what does that mean for the sport? Now, there is a bit of overlap for what we've talked about already, but let's make sure we cover it. Well, guess what? We get a loss of sponsors. I just said that for the personal sponsors of the athletes. Same for the sport if they become sort of tarnished this way. We get the cost of policing will go up, and that's of course a negative. It becomes sort of a cost that sort of, I guess, restricts profit. We also get the cost of CCTV, looking for retroactive punishments for people who maybe have been violent on the terraces. We've also got the cost of stewards. Okay, cost of stewards, make sure that incidents don't occur. This is expensive for, let's say, a rugby team or a football team or a hockey team or whatever it happens to be. We've got fewer families attending events. The sport becomes less and less linked to family atmosphere. Fewer families attending the events. That's a real negative, actually. It shouldn't be undermined. And they will spend money, families, so even on the commercial side. We'd also have fewer women that would attend, okay? So I'll specifically say attend here. Now, I'm not suggesting that women are never violent, but I think we can also make a general point in our society. Violence tends to be linked to men more. I mean, I think there's a lot of fact to that, although there are, of course, lots of exceptions. The sport might experience something like an international ban, a national team being banned from the Olympic Games, or football teams being banned from European competitions. The sport also generates negative role models, and we've mentioned this even from the individual performers' perspective, but this is a really negative aspect. This is hard to shake as well, of course. They would lose media revenue, so a sport might not be as saleable. Although that's an interesting one, because some kind of what is referred to as spectacular sports do include a bit of violence. Ice hockey is one that sort of springs to mind. And finally, well, actually, I think that is all of my points. So what I've covered there for you guys is a lot of content. I accept it's a lot for you guys to take it on board. But we've got the causes of players, the causes of spectators, and the implication of that violence for society, for performance and sport. Very comprehensive. I hope that's useful. Thanks.